It was just another typical Monday morning at Hillside High School, where the air was thick with the usual chaos of lockers slamming, students chattering, and the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallways. But for one student, today would be different. And little did anyone know, a single comment would set off a chain of events that would forever change the course of her life. "Let's go, guys." The bell's about to ring, Jessica's friend, Sarah, urged as she grabbed her backpack, pulling her down the hallway toward the music room. The two had been inseparable since middle school, bonding over their shared love of music. But today, Jessica was unusually quiet. Her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts swirling like the autumn leaves outside. As they entered the music room, the familiar sound of piano keys being played drifted toward them. It was the melody of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a piece that always gave Jessica a sense of peace. She hadn't been able to focus on the notes recently, though. Her mind had been clouded by a comment from Mr. Harrison, her music teacher, made earlier in the week during class. "You know, you really don't see many black students who are truly talented at playing piano," Mr. Harrison had said, almost absent-mindedly, as he glanced at the class roster. The words had hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. Her fingers had stiffened on the keys, but she remained silent, biting her tongue. But that silence was starting to eat away at her. "Did you hear what Mr. Harrison said the other day?" Sarah asked, breaking Jessica's reverie. Jessica stiffened, but forced a smile. "No, what did he say?" "Well, I overheard him talking to Mrs. Brooks in the teacher's lounge. He was saying that, it's rare to see someone like you, Jessica, really get a handle on something like piano." "Like, what does that even mean?" "We both know you're one of the best pianists in the whole school." Sarah's voice was loud, filled with disbelief. Jessica's heart raced. "It's rare to see someone like you." She had heard it before. The unspoken assumptions, the backhanded compliments. The dismissive attitude from people who assumed that just because she was black, she wouldn't excel at something like classical music. She knew her talent wasn't a fluke. Her parents had always encouraged her to pursue music, even when she was the only black kid in her piano lessons, the only one in recitals. She had been playing since she was 5, her tiny fingers creating melodies that spoke louder than any words could. But every time she succeeded, there was always that nagging voice in the back of her mind, the doubt planted by the world around her. "I'm going to prove him wrong," she muttered under her breath, barely loud enough for Sarah to hear. "What?" Sarah asked, leaning in. "I'm going to prove him wrong," Jessica repeated, her voice steady this time. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. "You should totally go for it. You can outplay anyone in that class. We all know that." But Jessica wasn't just thinking about her piano skills. She was thinking about something much bigger. It wasn't just about showing Mr. Harrison that she was good enough to play the piano. It was about challenging the narrow, outdated views of race that kept trying to limit her. "All right," she said, pushing the doubt aside. "I'm going to show them what I'm capable of." The bell rang, signaling the start of class. As she walked into the room, she could feel the weight of Mr. Harrison's eyes on her. He was sitting at his desk, scribbling something on a notepad, but his eyes flickered up for a moment when she entered. She kept her head high, determined not to let his presence shake her. "Jessica," Mr. Harrison called as she sat down at the piano, "I trust you're ready for today's lesson. I've got a special challenge for you." Jessica looked up at him, the challenge in his eyes almost mocking. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. The class proceeded as usual, with students playing scales and simple pieces, but Jessica's mind was elsewhere. She had no intention of playing a simple piece. She was going to play something that would leave everyone in awe. When her turn came, she stood up confidently and walked over to the grand piano. Her fingers brushed against the keys, and for a moment, everything fell away. There was only the music. She closed her eyes, letting the familiar notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 fill the room. The powerful, intricate melody spilled from her fingers, each note punctuated with the emotion she felt inside. Her soul poured into every chord. The sound was electric. She could hear the gasps from her classmates as they stopped what they were doing, unable to look away. Even Mr. Harrison's eyes widened as he leaned forward, clearly impressed by the sheer power and beauty of her performance. As the last note hung in the air, a stunned silence followed. Jessica slowly opened her eyes, looking around the room. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen. She had poured every ounce of herself into that performance. And the room was silent, not with judgment, but with awe. Mr. Harrison was the first to break the silence. I didn't know you could play like that," he said, his voice faltering. Jessica met his gaze, her heart pounding. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The message had been sent. It wasn't just about proving herself to him. It was about proving it to herself. As the class resumed, the atmosphere was different. There was a palpable shift in the air, as if the room itself recognized her talent. No longer would she let anyone tell her that she didn't belong. She had fought for this moment, and now that she had it, she would make sure it didn't slip away. That was the beginning of something more significant than just a piano recital. Jessica had set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life but also challenge the deeply ingrained prejudices that had tried to hold her back. And this was just the start. Maybe, she thought to herself as she walked out of the music room, this is just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The walk home was longer than usual for Jessica, her thoughts swirling, weighed down by the unexpected stir her performance had caused. Even the crisp fall air didn't seem to offer its usual calming effect. The golden leaves from the trees drifted to the ground in a soft, swirling dance as she walked, but her mind was a storm of its own. Mr. Harrison's eyes, wide with surprise, flashed in her mind repeatedly. She couldn't quite place why his reaction bothered her so much. Maybe it was the way he'd hesitated, like he didn't expect her to play that well, or maybe it was because of the barely disguised shock in his face. The idea that people saw her, and people like her, as something other had always been there, like a dull hum in the background of her life. But today, the hum felt louder, more obvious. Was that what it always was? Just a subtle disbelief that someone who looked like her could be good at something as refined as classical music? She thought about her mom's words, how she had always told her that life would never be fair, but that didn't mean she shouldn't keep proving people wrong. Jessica had grown up knowing that her path wouldn't be easy. She'd been one of only a handful of black students at Hillside High, and even fewer played instruments as seriously as she did. Still, there had been her parents, always in her corner, telling her to push forward. They had both immigrated to the United States with nothing but their hopes for a better life. They'd worked hard, overcome struggles, and even now, despite their success, they never let her forget that nothing worth having came easy. But lately, the weight of those struggles felt heavier. She reached her front porch, letting out a long breath, before pushing the door open. The smell of fresh cooking wafted from the kitchen. Her mother was at the stove, stirring something in a pot. "Hey, sweetie. How was school?" her mom called out, her voice filled with warmth, yet Jessica could hear the slight edge of concern in it. Jessica smiled faintly as she kicked off her shoes. It was interesting. Her mom raised an eyebrow, her expression curious. "Interesting, huh? What's that supposed to mean?" "Well," Jessica started, then stopped herself. She didn't want to bring her mom into it just yet. She didn't want to add to the frustration that she could already feel building. It was one thing for her to deal with it herself, but seeing her mother upset about it would only make things worse. "Nothing," Jessica added, trying to sound casual. "Just, school stuff. You know how it is." Her mother gave her a look that said she wasn't buying it, but didn't push further. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where I am. Dinner's almost ready." As her mom continued with the meal, Jessica sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The wind had picked up, the sky darkening in the distance. She thought about the piano and the way it felt to play, to pour herself into every note. That was the one place where the world's judgments seemed to fall away, where she could be free. But the reality was, people didn't always want to see her as anything other than what they expected. The comment from Mr. Harrison kept ringing in her ears. It wasn't just about her music. It was about her very identity. The unspoken words in his eyes, "You don't belong here," those words felt like they had been there her whole life, hidden behind polite smiles and the subtle, constant ways people placed limits on her potential. Still, Jessica refused to be limited. She could feel it in her bones. If anyone expected her to back down, they were wrong. At dinner, Jessica's mom turned to her with a soft smile. "You've been quiet tonight, honey. Are you sure everything's okay?" Jessica met her mother's gaze, weighing the decision to open up. She could tell her mom was sensing that something was off, but Jessica didn't want to voice her frustrations just yet. Maybe she could let the music do the talking. She would keep practicing, keep pushing herself further than anyone thought possible. If she showed them how good she was, how undeniable her talent was, maybe they wouldn't be able to ignore her anymore. "I'm fine, Mom," Jessica finally said, offering a reassuring smile. "Just a little tired, I guess." Her mom nodded, though Jessica could see the skepticism behind her eyes. She finished her dinner in silence, but her mind was elsewhere. That night, Jessica found herself back in front of the piano, her fingers pressing down on the cool ivory keys. She wasn't playing anything in particular at first, just letting the music come to her. Her mind wasn't on the music anymore, though, it was on the injustice of it all. Why should anyone have to prove themselves over and over again just to be seen as worthy? Then she thought about the others, Sarah, her best friend who had always supported her, who always saw her for who she truly was. But Jessica knew that not everyone had that kind of support. Not everyone had someone who believed in them unconditionally. So maybe, just maybe, her fight wasn't just about her. It was about showing the world that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve greatness if given the chance. And so, without even realizing it, Jessica's hands moved from casual playing to something much more purposeful, much more powerful. She played a melody that expressed everything she was feeling: frustration, anger, hope, and defiance. Each note was a statement. She had learned early in life that music was a language all its own, a language that didn't require words but could still speak volumes. Her fingers moved more confidently, the familiar rhythm flowing through her like a current. With each note, Jessica felt more sure of herself. She wasn't just playing piano anymore, she was preparing herself for something greater. Something that would make people see her, not just as a black girl at the piano, but as an artist, a force to be reckoned with. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "I'm going to show them what I'm made of." The days following Jessica's performance in class were a whirlwind. Word had spread quickly around Hillside High about the surprise talent she had showcased in front of everyone. It wasn't just her friends or classmates who had noticed her, even the teachers were talking about her. But despite the excitement that surrounded her music, there was still a lingering question hanging in the air, the question of whether or not her performance would change anything for her. Jessica had to admit, she was nervous. Nervous not because she doubted her talent, but because of what had happened afterward, Mr. Harrison's reaction. He'd said very little after her performance, but his eyes were full of things unsaid. For the first time in her life, she had felt like there were more layers to the world around her than just the music. There was a whole societal framework that weighed heavily on people like her, and sometimes, it felt like that weight was too much to shake off. The next day, during the lunch hour, Jessica sat with Sarah and a few other friends at their usual table in the cafeteria. As she picked at her food, trying to act casual, she could sense the whispers around her. A couple of students glanced over their shoulders, clearly gossiping. Jessica couldn't help but feel the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to let it show. "So," Sarah said, taking a deep breath, "I overheard Mr. Harrison talking to Coach Thompson this morning. He said you completely blew him away yesterday." Jessica frowned, her fork clinking against the edge of her plate. "He didn't say much to me after class," she muttered, trying to play it cool. "I don't know if I believe him, honestly. He didn't even seem like he knew what to say." "Oh, trust me, he was impressed," Sarah said, her voice taking on a teasing tone. "You've got to remember, he's got that big ego of his. He probably didn't expect someone like you to come in there and just wipe the floor with everyone." Sarah leaned in, her expression serious now. "But listen, Jess. If he's talking about you like that, it's only a matter of time before the whole school knows. I bet you'll be the talk of the music department soon." Jessica rolled her eyes, the corners of her mouth curling into a smile. "Yeah, right. Like that's a good thing. Don't pretend you don't care," Sarah teased. "You love the attention." Jessica raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw Mr. Harrison standing behind her, his expression unreadable. "Jessica, could I have a word?" he asked, his voice stiff but polite. Her stomach dropped. Sarah gave her an encouraging look, but Jessica could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She nodded slowly and followed Mr. Harrison to the corner of the cafeteria, away from the prying eyes of her classmates. When they were alone, Mr. Harrison let out a long sigh. I wanted to talk to you about yesterday," he said, his voice softer now, more thoughtful. "I want to apologize for the way I behaved in class. I wasn't prepared for what you played, and I can't deny that I underestimated you." Jessica stood quietly, her arms crossed. She didn't know how to respond. She could feel the heaviness in the air, but she didn't want to be the one to break the tension first. "I've been teaching music for a long time," Mr. Harrison continued, his tone heavy with experience. "And I've seen a lot of students come and go, but your talent is undeniable. It's rare." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "It's rare," she echoed, the words hanging between them like a challenge. "I didn't mean it like that," he said quickly. "What I meant to say was, I don't see many students who can play the way you do. Your performance was something special, Jessica. It was unexpected." The word unexpected rang in Jessica's mind, and she couldn't help but feel the sting again. "So, you thought I wasn't good enough until I proved you wrong?" "You don't see many students like me in the program," Jessica said, keeping her voice calm, but the edge was unmistakable. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Mr. Harrison blinked, clearly taken aback. No, Jessica. That's not what I meant. It's just, sometimes, people don't expect students like you to be as skilled at classical music as you are." "I should have never said what I said." Jessica's eyes narrowed, and she felt her pulse quicken. "Yeah, you should have never said it. But you did. And you think just an apology is enough?" Mr. Harrison hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know I've made a mistake, and I want to make it right. I just didn't think about how my words would affect you." She stared at him, trying to decide whether or not to believe him. His apology seemed sincere, but there was still something lingering in her chest, a knot of unresolved frustration. "Don't apologize to me," Jessica said quietly, her voice unwavering. "Apologize to all the other students you might have insulted without even realizing it. I'm not the only one who's been overlooked because of where I come from or what I look like. It's bigger than me, Mr. Harrison." He looked at her, his face softening with an understanding that hadn't been there before. "I didn't realize how much impact my words had on you, Jessica. I'm sorry for that. You deserve better." She nodded, a small sense of relief washing over her. She didn't forgive him outright, but she appreciated that he was finally getting it. At least, she thought, he was trying. "Thank you for acknowledging that," she said, her voice steady. "But just so you know, I'm not here to prove anything to anyone anymore. I'm here to show that I belong. Not because I need anyone's approval, but because I've worked for this. I've earned it." Mr. Harrison nodded again, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "You've more than earned it. And I'll do whatever I can to help you showcase that talent, Jessica." Jessica turned away, her heart still heavy but lighter than it had been when she first walked into the conversation. She wasn't sure where things would go from here, but one thing was clear, the challenge had only just begun. She didn't need anyone's validation anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. If they underestimated her, so be it. She would let her music do the talking. And when the final note was played, they would all have no choice but to listen. The following weeks felt like a slow build-up to something big. Jessica continued to attend class, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was changing, both in her and around her. After her tense conversation with Mr. Harrison, he began to take a more active interest in her progress. He'd started assigning her more challenging pieces, ones that pushed her abilities to their limits. It felt like a test, but Jessica wasn't intimidated. She thrived under pressure. By the time the regional music competition came up, Jessica was feeling ready. The event, which was held annually at the prestigious Hillcrest University, was an opportunity for young musicians to showcase their talent. Students from all over the region would compete, and many of them went on to receive scholarships or get offers from top music schools. Jessica had known about the competition for years, but she'd never thought she had a shot at it. Now, though, everything felt different. The morning Mr. Harrison first mentioned the competition, Jessica's heart skipped a beat. He had caught her after class, his face serious but with a hint of excitement behind his eyes. "Jessica," he started, clearing his throat, "I think you should enter the regional competition." At first, she thought he was joking. "Me? But I've never." "You've never competed before, I know. But from what I've seen from your playing, you've got a unique sound. A real gift." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "The judges there won't just be looking for technical skill. They'll be looking for something different. And you have that something." Jessica was speechless. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the sincerity behind them. "He believes in me," she thought, a spark of excitement igniting in her chest. "He really does." She glanced at the music sheets in her hands, then back at Mr. Harrison. "I don't know. I mean, it's a huge deal. I've seen the kind of talent that competes in that competition. People who've been playing since they were 5, with coaches and everything." Mr. Harrison shook his head. "Talent isn't just about who's had the most lessons or the best coaches. It's about what you can bring to the table that no one else can. And trust me, Jessica, you have that." The words had a weight to them. They carried an expectation, not a burden, but a challenge. It was up to Jessica to decide whether or not she would rise to it. "I'll think about it," she said, but deep down, she already knew the answer. There was no way she was going to let this chance slip by. The next few days were a blur of practice. Every spare moment she had was spent at the piano, trying to perfect her chosen piece, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The piece was demanding, both emotionally and technically, but Jessica was determined to make it her own. She played it over and over, her fingers dancing across the keys, each note bringing out new layers of expression. The music became a reflection of her, the frustrations, the dreams, the struggles. But as much as she loved the music, there were still moments of doubt. She was acutely aware of the competition that awaited her, and the heavy expectations that were attached to it. Could she really go up against seasoned musicians with years of experience? The pressure felt suffocating at times, but there was also a part of her that refused to give in to fear. She had to do this. "I've been working hard for this," she told herself one night as she stared at the piano keys, her hands frozen midair. "I've earned this." Her mom noticed the change in Jessica. It wasn't just the late nights spent practicing, there was a new fire in her eyes, a sense of determination that wasn't there before. One evening, as Jessica finished practicing, her mom came into the living room with a warm smile. "You've been practicing a lot lately." "I've noticed," her mom said, sitting down beside her on the couch. "What's going on, Jess?" Jessica looked at her mom, her expression a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Mr. Harrison wants me to enter the regional music competition," she said quietly. Her mom's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The one at Hillcrest?" "Yeah." Jessica nodded, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. "I'm not sure if I'm ready." "It's a big deal, Mom. I'm up against some really talented people." Her mom smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetie, you've always been talented. I've seen how hard you work. I believe in you. But you know, it's not just about winning. It's about showing up and doing your best. That's what matters." Jessica felt a warmth spread through her chest. Her mom always knew how to calm her nerves. But even with that reassurance, the nerves still lingered. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she messed up? That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the performance over and over in her head. She saw herself on stage, the bright lights blinding her, the audience staring, the judges watching with critical eyes. Her hands shook just thinking about it. But something inside of her also told her that this wasn't just about the competition. It was about proving something, about herself, about everyone who doubted her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that winning or losing didn't matter. What mattered was that she had a chance to finally step out of the shadows and make her voice heard. The next morning, Jessica made her decision. She was going to do it. She was going to enter the competition, no matter what. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she wasn't going to let fear keep her from taking this step. "I'm in," she said to Mr. Harrison when she saw him the next day. "I'll do it. I'm entering the competition." Mr. Harrison's eyes lit up with pride. "That's what I wanted to hear." Jessica took a deep breath. This is just the beginning, she thought. The competition would be fierce, but she was ready. She wasn't just going to play for the judges, the audience, or anyone else. She was going to play for herself. And that was the most important thing. The weeks leading up to the regional music competition were both exhilarating and terrifying. Jessica had made the decision to enter, and now it was a matter of preparing herself for the big day. Every spare moment was devoted to practice, every note scrutinized, every chord played with more intensity than the last. Mr. Harrison had become both a mentor and a motivator, pushing her further than she'd ever gone before. He wasn't going easy on her, but Jessica didn't want him to. She needed this challenge, not just for the competition, but for herself. One afternoon after school, as Jessica was playing through a particularly difficult section of Ballade No. 1, Mr. Harrison walked over, his footsteps quiet against the floor. He stood behind her, watching as she lost herself in the music, her fingers dancing across the piano keys. "Slow down, Jessica," he said softly, his tone gentle but firm. "You're rushing through the parts that matter. Focus on the feeling, not just the speed." Jessica took a deep breath and nodded, trying to calm her mind. She'd been pushing herself so hard to get every note perfect that she hadn't been paying attention to the emotional core of the music. "Slow down," she repeated to herself. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the music settle deep inside her. She let the melancholy chords fill the space, letting each note breathe, each pause resonate. When she finished the passage, Mr. Harrison was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful. "That's better," he said, his voice soft with approval. "It's not just about hitting the right notes, Jessica. It's about telling a story with your music. You've got the technique, but now you need to let the emotion speak for itself. Jessica felt a new sense of determination rise within her. She could do this. She would do this. But even with the encouragement, the pressure was mounting. The reality of the competition weighed heavily on her, and no matter how hard she tried to stay focused on the music, the thought of standing before an audience of judges, all judging her every move, loomed like a dark cloud. As the competition day drew closer, Jessica's nerves began to intensify. It wasn't just the prospect of performing for the judges, it was the idea that her entire identity, everything she had worked for, everything she had built up, was now tied to this one moment. Her heart would be exposed for all to see. Her fears would be laid bare. One evening, as she walked home from school, her mind spiraled with doubts. She had spent so much time practicing that she hadn't allowed herself the space to think about anything else. But now, with the competition just days away, she couldn't ignore the fear that was creeping in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she messed up on stage? Jessica. A voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see Sarah running toward her, a wide grin on her face. "Oh, hey," Jessica said, forcing a smile. "What's up?" "I've been meaning to talk to you," Sarah said, catching her breath. "I heard you're entering the competition." "That's amazing." Jessica felt a knot form in her stomach. "Yeah. I guess." Sarah looked at her closely, sensing the hesitation in Jessica's voice. "Hey, what's going on? You've been practicing like crazy for weeks, right? You're totally ready for this. I've seen you play. You're incredible." Jessica hesitated, glancing down at the sidewalk beneath her feet. "I don't know, Sarah. It's huge, you know. What if I mess up? What if everyone realizes I'm not good enough?" "Jessica, listen to me," Sarah said, stepping closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've worked harder for this than anyone I know. You've got this. You've got the talent, the heart, and the passion. Don't let fear stop you from showing the world what you're capable of." Jessica looked at her, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Sarah. I just needed to hear that." Sarah grinned. "Anytime. And hey, when you win, I'll be the first one to congratulate you." Jessica chuckled, though the thought of winning still seemed far off. But as she walked home that evening, something inside her shifted. Maybe it wasn't about winning after all. Maybe it was just about giving it her all, showing the world who she was, and letting the music speak for itself. The next few days felt like a blur of preparations. Her mom had already arranged for them to drive to Hillcrest University, and Jessica's excitement grew with each passing hour. But the nerves were still there, lurking beneath the surface. On the morning of the competition, Jessica barely ate breakfast, too anxious to focus on anything but the music and the looming performance. Her mom, always the steadying force in her life, kept the mood light with quiet encouragement. "You've been preparing for this day for so long, Jess. It's just another step in your journey," her mom said as they drove to the competition. "You've already accomplished so much just by being here." Jessica smiled weakly, though the anxiety still twisted in her stomach. The university campus looked both grand and intimidating as they arrived. The towering buildings and the gleaming concert hall were the stuff of dreams, and Jessica couldn't help but feel small in their shadow. But as they walked through the doors of the concert hall, something inside of her clicked. This was where she was supposed to be. She wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. She was here to do what she loved, and nothing else mattered. Her name was called, and Jessica made her way backstage. Her fingers trembled slightly as she waited for her turn. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "You can do this," she thought. "You've worked your whole life for this moment." When her turn finally came, she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, the judge's scrutiny. But she knew that none of that mattered. This was her time, and it was her music that would speak for her. She sat down at the grand piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. As the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the room, all of her fears melted away. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. She let the music flow through her, each note an expression of everything she had been through, everything she was. And in that moment, Jessica knew one thing for sure: she was finally being heard. The sound of Jessica's piano echoed through the grand hall, its rich, melancholy chords filling every corner of the space. It was like everything around her faded away, the judges, the audience, the blinding lights above her. There was only the music, and her. In those moments, she wasn't just Jessica, the girl from the small town with big dreams. She was the music itself, alive and breathing. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision, but also with emotion. The long, swirling phrases of Ballade No. 1 seemed to carry a story that only Jessica could tell. And she told it with every fiber of her being. As the piece drew to a close, she felt a quiet calm settle over her. The final notes hung in the air, resonating, before they softly faded into silence. For a brief, suspended moment, there was nothing. Then, the audience burst into applause. It wasn't a polite clapping. It was the kind of applause that came from genuine admiration. Jessica sat there for a second, unsure of what to do. Did she move? Did she acknowledge the audience? Her heart was racing, her palms slick with sweat, but her eyes shone with something else. A kind of quiet pride. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. The applause seemed to go on forever, and when it finally subsided, Jessica stood and bowed, a modest smile on her face. She made her way off stage, still dazed by what had just happened. She couldn't believe it, she had done it. Behind the stage, the air was thick with nervous energy. Musicians milled about, some with hands shaking, others with their heads buried in music sheets. As Jessica walked past them, she saw faces she recognized from her high school, familiar students who had always been at the top of the class. They were staring at her, some of them surprised, others perhaps a bit envious. She could tell that her performance had caught their attention. Maybe they didn't expect this from me, she thought, but the realization didn't bother her. If anything, it gave her a sense of power. She had done something they didn't expect. She had defied the odds. Jessica took a deep breath as she made her way to the back of the hall where her mom was waiting. Her heart was still pounding, her thoughts swirling, but seeing her mom's proud, welcoming smile was enough to calm her. "You did amazing, Jess," her mom said, wrapping her arms around her in a tight hug. "I could tell you gave everything you had up there." "Thanks, Mom," Jessica said, her voice slightly shaky but filled with gratitude. She hadn't realized how much she needed her mom's reassuring presence until that moment. They sat together in the back of the hall, waiting for the results. Time felt like it was moving in slow motion. Jessica couldn't stop replaying her performance in her head. Every tiny movement, every subtle change in tempo, it all felt so vivid, like she was still on stage. What would the judges think? What if it wasn't enough? Finally, the moment of truth arrived. The judges called all the contestants onto the stage for the announcement of the winners. Jessica stood with the others, her hands folded in front of her, her stomach a tight knot. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the judges began speaking, and the anticipation in the air was almost unbearable. And now, for the third-place award, the lead judge began, his voice deep and steady. Jessica held her breath. "Third place goes to Ethan Caldwell." The audience applauded as Ethan, a tall, dark-haired student from a local music academy, made his way to the front. Jessica couldn't help but admire his composure. Ethan had been one of the favorites to win, his flawless technique often talked about in hushed tones before the competition. But as Jessica glanced over at him, something stirred inside her. This isn't over yet. I have a chance. And now, second place, the judge continued, his voice cutting through the silence. Second place goes to Sarah Montgomery. Jessica's heart sank for a moment. She and Sarah had been friendly competitors throughout the years. Sarah's talent was undeniable, but Jessica knew she had something different, something she couldn't name but felt deeply inside her. Still, seeing Sarah take the second-place spot made Jessica feel both proud of her friend and even more determined. And now, for the first-place winner, the judge announced, his voice low and suspenseful. The first-place winner is Jessica Carter. The words hit Jessica like a wave. It took her a moment to comprehend what had just happened. Her name echoed in the hall, and before she knew it, the applause was deafening. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to process the reality of what had just occurred. The judges were smiling, gesturing for her to come forward. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her to the stage as if she were in a dream. Her mind was spinning, but all she could focus on was the overwhelming sense of pride and disbelief that washed over her. "Congratulations, Jessica," the lead judge said, shaking her hand firmly. "That was an exceptional performance. You showed not only skill, but a rare emotional depth. You're a true artist." Jessica could hardly find her voice, but she managed to whisper, "Thank you." As she stood there, the weight of the moment slowly sinking in, she saw the faces in the crowd, her mom's beaming face, the familiar faces of her classmates, and even Mr. Harrison, who gave her a proud nod from the back of the room. "I did it," she thought. "I really did it." After receiving her first-place trophy and taking a few more photos with the judges, Jessica made her way off the stage, the reality of what had just happened finally starting to settle in. She had won. She had earned her place among the best. But it wasn't just the trophy she was holding that made her feel victorious. It was the feeling that had been building up inside of her from the moment she made the decision to enter the competition, the feeling that, for the first time in her life, she was no longer hidden in the shadows. She was seen. And nothing, not even her biggest fears, could take that away from her. The days following the competition felt surreal. Jessica's name was now buzzing all over the school, and the music department was abuzz with excitement. Her classmates, teachers, and even those who had once dismissed her as just another student, were now congratulating her, and it was almost overwhelming. Yet, amid all the attention, Jessica couldn't help but feel like something had changed inside her. She wasn't just Jessica anymore, she was the Jessica Carter, the one who had stunned everyone at the regional music competition. It was a strange feeling, knowing that she now had the power to captivate people with her music, and yet, part of her wasn't sure what to do with that newfound attention. One morning, as she walked through the crowded hallway at school, she saw Sarah standing by her locker, talking to a few of their friends. Sarah's smile was wide, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of pride and something else that Jessica couldn't quite put her finger on. As Jessica approached, Sarah's gaze met hers, and she grinned. "Hey, superstar," Sarah said with a wink, her voice teasing but warm. Jessica chuckled, feeling the weight of her recent win settle on her shoulders again. "Hey, Sarah. Thanks. I heard you got a lot of praise for that performance. You deserved it, Jess. That was incredible." Jessica smiled, but she could feel the tension creeping in. She knew that Sarah had been aiming for the top spot too, and now, even though they were friends, something felt slightly off. Sarah was a talented pianist, and Jessica respected her, but winning had always been a goal for both of them. The pressure to outdo one another had been a constant presence in their shared love for music. "Yeah, it was really unexpected," Jessica said, trying to brush off the unease. "But it feels good. I've been working for this moment for a long time." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, but her gaze was distant for a moment. Then she looked back at Jessica, offering a warm smile. "You've earned it, Jess. Seriously. I mean it." Jessica wanted to believe her, but the small pang of discomfort in her chest wouldn't go away. She had won. But now, she was starting to realize that winning wasn't just about the trophy. It was about navigating the shifting dynamics of friendships and relationships, and it wasn't always as simple as standing on a stage. Later that week, Jessica was walking home when her phone buzzed with a text. It was from her mom. Got an email today. There's an offer from a prestigious music academy in New York. They want to meet with you. This could be a big opportunity. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. An offer? From a prestigious academy? She stared at the screen for a few moments, trying to process the gravity of the message. Could this be real? Was this the moment that would change everything for her? She sat down on a nearby bench, her mind racing. An opportunity to study at a world-renowned music academy in New York. That was the kind of thing she had dreamed about for years but never thought could actually happen. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Mr. Harrison. I saw the results. Well done, Jessica. There's something else I'd like to discuss with you when you have the time. I think it's time to start thinking about the next step. The weight of both messages settled in her chest. The next step. She had won the competition, but now it seemed like the universe was offering her something much bigger. The possibility of her future, of a life surrounded by music and the people who understood her craft, was suddenly within her reach. She walked home, lost in thought, unsure of how to process everything. The excitement, the pressure, and the realization that her life might never be the same again were all colliding. And yet, there was a part of her that felt ready. The next day at school, Jessica could barely focus on anything. Her mind was consumed with the news of the Academy's offer and Mr. Harrison's message. She tried to push through the day, but every time she saw someone glance at her or heard her name whispered down the hall, her stomach flipped. It was as though her life was in the process of being rewritten in real time, and she was struggling to catch up. During lunch, Jessica found herself sitting alone in the cafeteria, her phone in her lap, still buzzing with messages. She needed to talk to someone about it, but who? Sarah seemed like the logical choice. She had always been her closest friend, and they had shared everything. But after their brief interaction earlier that morning, Jessica wasn't sure if it was the right moment. Just as she was about to text her mom back, she felt a presence beside her. She looked up to see Mr. Harrison standing by her table, a look of determination in his eyes. Hey, Jessica. Got a minute? He asked. Of course, Mr. Harrison, she replied, surprised to see him here during lunch. What's up? He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I've been thinking about your future. And I wanted to be the one to bring it up with you, instead of letting someone else make the decision for you. Jessica blinked, confused. My future? Yeah. I know you've been approached by some big names lately. New York's a great opportunity, but it's not just about the academics or the prestige. It's about finding the right environment for you to grow as an artist. Jessica nodded slowly, feeling a rush of emotions. This was it. This was the conversation she had been waiting for. I've seen your potential, Jessica, Mr. Harrison continued. You have a gift, but it's not just about being the best in a competition. It's about pushing boundaries, finding your own voice. And New York, it could be the place that helps you do that. But I need you to ask yourself, is that where you want to be? Will you be able to handle the intensity of it? Jessica's heart was racing. She hadn't expected this level of guidance from Mr. Harrison. It felt like he was treating her not just as a student, but as an equal in this decision-making process. She took a deep breath. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I've dreamed about it my whole life, but now that it's real, it feels overwhelming. What if I'm not ready? You are ready, he said firmly, leaning forward. But more importantly, you have to trust yourself. You've earned this moment, Jessica. You've worked for it. And you have every right to embrace it. Jessica looked at him, her mind buzzing with all the possibilities. It was clear that this moment was the beginning of something huge. Whether it was New York, the academy, or another path, it was her decision to make. And whatever she chose, she would need to be true to herself. As Mr. Harrison stood to leave, he gave her a reassuring smile. Take your time. You don't need to rush. Just remember, the world is full of opportunities, but only you can decide where you want to go. Jessica watched him walk away, her thoughts swirling. The next step was terrifying, but she felt ready to take it. The weekend after her conversation with Mr. Harrison, Jessica felt as though her entire world had shifted. The weight of the potential decision hanging over her was both exhilarating and terrifying. New York. The Music Academy. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about for years, but now that it was right in front of her, she couldn't shake the sense of uncertainty gnawing at her. She was sitting in her room that Saturday afternoon, her fingers lightly brushing over the piano keys, not really playing anything specific. Her mind kept racing, questions, doubts, and possibilities swirling around, making it difficult to focus. Every time she thought she might be leaning toward one choice, another thought would pull her in a different direction. Was she ready for this level of commitment? Could she handle the pressure of moving to a new city, away from home, with no guarantee that she would succeed? Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her mom. I made an appointment for you with the academy director. You should talk to them before making any decisions. I know you'll do great, Jess. The message brought a new wave of nerves, but also a little bit of clarity. It wasn't just about the trophy she had won. It was about the next step, whatever that looked like. She was now being pushed into a world that was so much bigger than she had ever imagined, and the decision would set the course for her future. Was this the right time to make such a huge leap? She looked out of the window at the sprawling view of her small town. She had always loved this town, the quiet, the familiarity, and the comfort of being surrounded by people who knew her. But she also knew there was something else waiting for her beyond its borders, something bigger. The question was, could she leave this life behind and step into the unknown? The day of the meeting with the academy director came quickly. Jessica's heart was in her throat as she rode in the car with her mom, heading toward the music academy's headquarters. The closer they got, the more her nerves escalated. Her mom had been nothing but supportive, but she could see the nervousness in Jessica's eyes. Are you okay? Her mom asked, glancing at her. Jessica let out a breath and gave a half smile. Yeah, just nervous. What if they don't like me? What if I'm not good enough? Her mom reached over, squeezing her hand gently. Jessica, you are more than good enough. You're talented, dedicated, and you have something special that no one can take away from you. Remember, this is just the first step. Whatever happens, it's not the end. It's just a new beginning. Jessica nodded, taking comfort in her mom's words. Still, the anxiety gnawed at her. The academy was a prestigious place, filled with some of the most talented musicians in the world. Would they see her as just another small-town girl trying to make it big? When they arrived at the academy, the towering glass building looked almost intimidating. It was sleek, modern, and a far cry from the cozy, rustic charm of her hometown. The contrast felt like a physical representation of the world she was about to enter, something she wasn't sure she could fully comprehend yet. As they walked through the front doors, they were greeted by a receptionist who led them to a waiting area. Jessica sat down in a plush chair, her hands resting nervously on her lap. The waiting room was quiet, almost reverent, filled with polished grand pianos and framed photos of famous musicians who had walked these halls. Her mom noticed the anxiety in her posture and gave her a small, encouraging smile. You've got this, Jess. Jessica tried to smile back, but she was too caught up in the moment. The door to the director's office opened, and a tall, middle-aged man stepped out, offering them both a welcoming smile. Jessica. I'm Mr. Williams, the academy director. It's a pleasure to meet you, he said, extending his hand. Jessica shook his hand, her nerves barely contained. Nice to meet you, sir. Please, come in, Mr. Williams said, gesturing toward the door. We're excited to get to know you better. Inside, the office was filled with elegant furnishings, and a grand piano sat in the corner, its polished surface gleaming. Mr. Williams led them to a pair of chairs by the window, where they both sat down. The director took his seat across from them, folding his hands in front of him. I've heard a lot about you, Jessica. Your performance at the regional competition was nothing short of exceptional. You have a rare gift, Mr. Williams began, his voice calm and authoritative. Jessica felt a mixture of pride and nerves wash over her at his words. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to feel humble or like she was being overly praised, but she nodded in acknowledgement. Thank you, sir. It still feels unreal. Well, it's very real. We believe you have tremendous potential, Jessica. This academy could be the perfect place for you to hone your craft, and we'd love to have you join us, Mr. Williams continued. Jessica's heart skipped a beat at his words. This was happening. They actually want me. But before she could respond, Mr. Williams leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. I know this is a big decision, and it's not one to take lightly. But we want to make sure that you feel fully prepared for the challenges ahead. New York will be a very different world than what you've known here. It's intense, competitive, and demanding. But it's also a place where you can truly grow as an artist. So, I need to ask you, Jessica, what is it that you want for yourself? What is your vision for your future? Her mind raced. What do I want? She took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tapping against the arm of the chair. I want to be the best I can be. I want to push myself beyond my limits, to discover new aspects of music that I haven't even imagined yet. But I also don't want to lose myself in the process. I want to stay true to who I am. Mr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what we hope for our students. To become their truest selves as artists. It won't be easy, Jessica. But we believe you can do it. Jessica looked over at her mom, who gave her an encouraging smile. She had so many questions, so many doubts, but in this moment, something inside her clicked. This was it. This was the chance she had worked for, and she could no longer hold back. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady. I want to take this step. Mr. Williams smiled. Good. We'll get started on the paperwork, and we'll help guide you through the process. Welcome to the academy, Jessica. And in that moment, Jessica realized that this was the beginning of everything. She had stepped into a world that was bigger than her small town. A world that was all hers to conquer. Her future, like the music she loved, was full of endless possibilities. The weeks following her meeting with the academy director were a whirlwind. The application process for the prestigious music academy in New York had officially begun, and Jessica was filled with a mix of excitement and dread. Every day brought something new, forms to fill out, emails to respond to, phone calls to make, but through it all, one thing remained clear: her life was changing, and there was no going back. Her mom had been her constant support through it all, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too fast. She had been just an ordinary high school student, trying to find her way in the world, and now she was about to step into a new life. A life she wasn't sure she was entirely prepared for. She spent every spare moment at the piano, practicing her scales, perfecting her technique, and choosing new pieces to master. The pressure was on, but every time she played, it was as though the music gave her a sense of calm, reminding her of the one thing she could control. Music had always been her constant, her outlet, her escape, her passion. But now, it was also the key to her future. One afternoon, as she sat in her room, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah. Hey, can we talk? I know we haven't really had the chance to catch up since the competition. Jessica hesitated before responding. She had been avoiding Sarah a bit lately, unsure of how to navigate their shifting relationship. Things felt different. The competition had changed the dynamics between them, and she wasn't sure where they stood anymore. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't leave things unresolved. Sure. How about later? I'm free after 4. Sarah's reply came almost immediately. Great. I'll meet you at the coffee shop in an hour. I need to see you, Jess. Jessica walked into the local coffee shop an hour later, scanning the tables for Sarah. She spotted her in the corner, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in front of her. Sarah looked up as soon as Jessica entered, and her face broke into a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Hey, Sarah said, waving her over. Jessica walked toward her and sat down across from her, feeling a familiar tension in the air. The silence stretched between them for a few moments before Sarah finally spoke. I've been thinking a lot about the competition, Sarah began, her voice quieter than usual. And about you. Jessica raised an eyebrow, unsure where this conversation was headed. What about me? I don't know, Sarah said with a sigh. I guess I'm just proud of you. I know we were both trying to win, and you did, and I want you to know that it's not just about the trophy. I'm happy for you, Jess. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. She had been so focused on her own doubts and fears that she hadn't stopped to consider how Sarah might be feeling. Sarah had always been her competitor in a way, and to hear her speak like this, it meant more than she realized. I didn't want it to change things between us, Jessica said softly, her voice tinged with guilt. I know it's been a little weird, but I never meant for us to drift apart. You've always been my best friend, Sarah. Sarah smiled faintly, a look of understanding in her eyes. I know. It's just. I think we've both been chasing the same dream for so long, and now, with everything changing for you, going to New York and all, I don't know where I fit in anymore. Jessica's heart ached as she listened to Sarah's words. She had never considered how Sarah might feel in all of this. It wasn't just about her journey, it was about the impact her success had on the people closest to her. I don't want to lose you, Sarah, Jessica said earnestly. I've been so caught up in this whirlwind that I didn't even stop to think about how this might affect us. But you're still my friend. I'm still the same person I was before all of this. Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, taking Jessica's hand. I know, Jess. I just want to make sure we're both okay with this. I want you to succeed, but I also don't want to lose the friendship that we've always had. Jessica squeezed Sarah's hand, a sense of relief washing over her. We won't lose it. I promise. For the first time in weeks, Jessica felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just about the opportunity ahead of her, it was about the people she was leaving behind and the relationships she still needed to nurture. This moment with Sarah, though difficult, felt like the first step toward finding balance again. The next day, Jessica sat down at her piano once more, her fingers brushing over the keys as she thought about the future. She had made her decision to go to New York, and she was starting to feel a sense of purpose in it. But there were still questions that lingered, questions she wasn't sure how to answer just yet. As she played, the familiar melodies of Chopin filled the room, her fingers moving across the keys with precision and emotion. It was in these moments, when she was lost in the music, that Jessica felt truly herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The future was daunting, but it was also filled with possibilities. She knew there would be challenges ahead, more competition, more doubts, and more hard decisions. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had her music. She had her family. And she had her friends. In that moment, Jessica made a promise to herself. She would follow her dreams, but she wouldn't forget where she came from or who she was along the way. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for whatever it would bring. The decision had been made. Jessica was officially headed to New York, and the whirlwind of preparations had only just begun. The Academy's acceptance letter had arrived, and with it, a flood of emotions. The excitement was undeniable, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. But with it also came a sense of dread, the heavy weight of leaving behind everything familiar. Packing her bags felt surreal. As she folded her clothes and placed them carefully into the suitcase, Jessica couldn't help but think about how much her life was about to change. Her childhood bedroom, the walls adorned with posters of musicians and favorite movie quotes, was slowly being transformed into a space that no longer felt like hers. The small town she had always called home was now an unfamiliar backdrop, one she would soon be leaving behind. Her mom helped her gather the last few things, all the while offering words of encouragement. "You're going to do amazing, Jess. This is what you've been working for. This is your moment." Jessica smiled weakly, still not entirely sure how she felt about it. She wasn't scared of the Academy or of New York, she was scared of what she might leave behind. The safety of her small town, the comfort of knowing everyone around her, the simplicity of life before it all became complicated. It was easy to romanticize the idea of chasing dreams from afar, but the reality of it was much more overwhelming. "Thanks, Mom," Jessica said, trying to muster some confidence. "I just don't know if I'm ready for everything to change." Her mom placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "You've been ready for this your whole life. You're more than ready, Jess." The day she left was bittersweet. It was one thing to dream about New York, but another to actually step onto the plane that would carry her into a new world. As she boarded the flight with her mom by her side, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into an unknown abyss. She tried to convince herself that this was what she wanted, but doubt still crept in. Her mom smiled at her, trying to ease the tension. "This is going to be great, honey. You're going to meet so many incredible people. You'll learn things you never thought possible." Jessica nodded, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her friends and family, and everything she was leaving behind. She thought about Sarah, and their heart-to-heart conversation just days before. There had been something healing about it, but Jessica still wasn't sure how everything would play out once she was miles away from home. Would their friendship survive? Would she be able to stay true to herself in the midst of everything that would come? Before long, the flight attendants were preparing the cabin for landing, and Jessica's heart began to race. New York. The city she had always dreamed of visiting, the place where so many of her idols had performed. Now, she was going to live there, study there, and build her future there. It was exciting, but also terrifying. As the plane descended toward the city, Jessica stared out of the window. The skyline was like something out of a movie, tall buildings, endless streets, and the river winding its way through it all. It was the real deal, and in just a few minutes, she would be right in the middle of it. The airport was chaotic, just as Jessica had expected. People were hustling everywhere, carrying luggage, making phone calls, rushing to catch their next flight. Jessica's head spun as she tried to follow the signs to baggage claim, her mind still trying to adjust to the enormity of the situation. This was not her quiet hometown anymore, this was New York City, and everything felt larger than life. She and her mom collected their bags and made their way outside, where a taxi was waiting to take them to the Academy's dorms. Jessica felt her stomach flip as they drove through the city streets, the towering skyscrapers looming on either side. It was a blur of sights and sounds, the cacophony of honking horns, people talking, and the distant hum of the subway. Everything felt so fast, so alive. It was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Finally, they arrived at the dormitory, a tall building nestled in the heart of the city. Jessica stepped out of the taxi, her legs a little shaky as she took in the scene. This was where she would live now. Where she would grow, learn, and struggle. This was her new reality. The dorm was a modern building with sleek, minimalist decor. The walls were a soft gray, and the floors were polished wood. It didn't have the warmth of home, but there was something about it that made it feel like a fresh start. Jessica felt both a sense of awe and apprehension as she walked inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. They were led to her room, a small but comfortable space with a desk by the window and a bed against the wall. Her mom helped her set up her things, and as they unpacked, Jessica felt a strange mixture of excitement and sadness. This was it. Her life in New York was beginning, but at the same time, she was saying goodbye to everything that had shaped her. "I think I'll be okay," Jessica said quietly as she turned to her mom, trying to reassure both of them. "It's just going to take some getting used to." Her mom smiled and hugged her tightly. "I know you will. You're strong, Jess. You've got this." As Jessica unpacked the last of her clothes, she looked around the room. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And that was the first step. There would be challenges, no doubt, but this was her opportunity. It was time to stop dreaming about what could be and start living the life she had always imagined. The next few days were filled with orientation sessions, meetings with other students, and getting accustomed to the pace of the academy. Everything moved so quickly, there were classes to attend, performances to prepare for, and a constant stream of activity that seemed to keep Jessica on her toes. But despite the busyness, she couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. The other students were incredibly talented, many of them having already been exposed to the intense training and competition of the music world for years. She felt like an outsider in a way, unsure of where she fit in or how to make her mark. And then, one evening, as she was walking through the academy's lobby, she saw a familiar face. It was Sarah. Standing there, holding a cello case in her hand, looking just as lost as Jessica felt. "Sarah?" Jessica called out, surprised but relieved. Sarah turned around, her eyes lighting up when she saw Jessica. "Jess! You made it. I had no idea you were coming here." Jessica smiled, feeling a surge of warmth in her chest. "I didn't either, honestly. But here I am." They stood there for a moment, both of them laughing nervously as the realization settled in. They were both here. In New York. Together, but apart from the world they had known. "So, how's it been?" Sarah asked, shifting the cello case to her other hand. "It's overwhelming," Jessica admitted. "I feel like I'm in over my head sometimes. But I guess that's part of the journey, right?" Sarah nodded in agreement. "Definitely. But hey, we'll figure it out together. You're not alone here, Jess. We've got this." And for the first time since stepping off the plane, Jessica felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? In the weeks that followed, Jessica tried to adjust to the constant flux of life at the academy. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge. The schedule was grueling, the expectations high, and the competition fierce. It wasn't just about being good, it was about being the best. And while Jessica had always prided herself on her talent, here, she realized, the stakes were different. She woke up early every morning to practice, determined to prove that she deserved her spot. But no matter how much she pushed herself, there was always someone who seemed to be ahead. Her classmates were brilliant. Some were prodigies, others virtuosos, all with skills that made her own feel inadequate at times. The stress weighed on her. She would spend hours in the practice rooms, running scales, learning new pieces, trying to perfect every note, every nuance. The physical strain on her hands and wrists was exhausting, but it was nothing compared to the mental toll. She felt like she was constantly playing catch-up, always one step behind, always trying to prove herself. And yet, despite the pressure, something inside her refused to back down. This was what she had wanted for so long, and now that she was here, there was no way she was going to let fear hold her back. Her room became a sanctuary of sorts, her only place of solace in the chaos of New York. She would often spend late nights there, playing her piano with the door shut, the music filling the silence and soothing her frayed nerves. In those moments, she remembered why she loved music in the first place. It wasn't about competing or being the best. It was about expression, about finding a voice through the keys, a voice that could tell stories and evoke emotions in a way nothing else could. But as the weeks passed, her doubts started to creep back in. She began to question whether she truly belonged here, whether she had what it took to make it in a world that seemed so out of her league. One day, after a particularly challenging class, Jessica was walking back to her dorm when she ran into Sarah. She had been so lost in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice her standing by the door to the practice rooms. "Hey," Sarah said, her face brightening when she saw Jessica. "How's it going?" Jessica sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping. "It's a lot. I don't know. I just feel like I'm barely keeping up. Everyone here is so much more experienced than I am." Sarah stepped closer, offering a sympathetic smile. "I get it. But don't let them make you doubt yourself. You're just as good as any of them. You've always had that spark, Jess. You have something special that they can't take away from you." Jessica smiled weakly, grateful for Sarah's reassurance, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it. "Thanks, Sarah. I don't know if I'm cut out for this." The doubt lingered in her mind, gnawing at her like a constant presence. But Sarah's words stayed with her, and Jessica found herself clinging to them, even if she wasn't ready to fully embrace them. The following week, the academy held a student recital. It was a big deal, a chance for students to perform in front of each other and the faculty, to show what they had learned so far. Jessica had been selected to perform, and while part of her was thrilled, another part was terrified. The thought of performing in front of so many accomplished musicians made her stomach twist. The night of the recital arrived, and Jessica stood backstage, pacing nervously. She was dressed in a formal black gown, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edges of her dress. The sound of applause from the audience echoed in the hall, and she felt her heart rate spike. "You're going to be amazing," Sarah said from behind her, offering a final bit of encouragement. "Just remember, it's not about the judges or the audience. It's about you and the music. Let it speak for you." Jessica nodded, taking a deep breath as she stepped onto the stage. The bright lights hit her immediately, blinding her for a moment before her eyes adjusted. The grand piano stood in front of her, and as she took her seat, the room fell silent. She placed her hands on the keys, the cool ivory beneath her fingertips grounding her. Her mind raced as she tried to focus, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She closed her eyes for a brief second, finding comfort in the familiar sound of the piano. And then, without thinking, she began to play. The music flowed from her, and for the first time in weeks, the nerves started to fade. She lost herself in the piece, each note feeling like an extension of her soul. As the melody filled the hall, she could feel herself opening up, allowing the music to carry her, to speak for her in a way words never could. By the time she finished, the silence in the room was almost deafening. The audience didn't clap immediately, there was a brief, breathless pause before the applause erupted. Jessica felt a sense of relief wash over her as she stood and took a bow, her heart still pounding from the performance. When she stepped off the stage, Sarah was waiting for her backstage, her eyes shining. "You were incredible," she said, wrapping her arms around Jessica in a hug. "I knew you had it in you." Jessica smiled, still trying to catch her breath. "I don't know if I've ever felt so alive." It was a small victory, but it meant everything to Jessica. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she had proven something, not to anyone else, but to herself. She was capable. She could do this. The following days brought a sense of renewed purpose. Jessica's confidence had taken a boost, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was constantly battling against an invisible wall. Her practice sessions became more focused, her performances more authentic. There was still the pressure, the looming uncertainty of what came next, but for the first time in a while, Jessica realized she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. It was a turning point, but it was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, and Jessica knew that challenges would continue to come her way. But she had learned something invaluable: success wasn't about being perfect, it was about finding the courage to keep going, to keep playing, even when the world around her felt like it was spinning too fast. And with that realization, Jessica felt ready to take on whatever came next. She wasn't just a student at a prestigious academy in New York. She was an artist, one with a story to tell, a melody to share, and a future that was hers to create. As the months flew by, Jessica's life at the academy continued to unfold in ways she hadn't expected. She was adjusting to the rhythm of New York City, to the intensity of her studies, and to the ever-increasing pressure of living up to the expectations around her. Every day was a new challenge, a new obstacle to overcome. But she had found her footing. She was more than just a student now, she was a musician, and New York, with all its noise and chaos, was her stage. But as her confidence grew, so did the intensity of her relationships with her peers. In a place so competitive, everyone had something to prove. And sometimes, that came at the cost of friendships. Jessica found herself at the center of a growing divide between some of her classmates, particularly with a few of the more established students. Among them was Emily, a pianist who had been at the academy longer than Jessica and had a reputation for being a little tough. Emily was incredibly talented, and though Jessica had admired her skill from afar, their interactions had been few and far between. But things started to shift. It began during a group rehearsal. Jessica had been selected to participate in a collaborative piece with a few other students, a rare opportunity that she had worked hard to earn. It was supposed to be a chance for them all to shine. But during one of the rehearsals, Emily had become noticeably dismissive toward Jessica. "Really?" Emily said, rolling her eyes as Jessica made a suggestion about the tempo. "You think that's going to work? You're not even hearing what I'm hearing. Maybe if you slowed down a little, you'd understand what the rest of us are trying to do." Jessica felt the sting of her words, the implication that she was out of her depth. She bit her lip, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Sorry," Jessica replied, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "I just thought it might help with the flow." Emily didn't respond immediately but gave her a tight-lipped smile before turning her attention back to the piano, her fingers striking the keys with precision. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jessica could feel the weight of the moment hanging over her. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about proving herself. After the rehearsal, Jessica found herself replaying the interaction in her head, trying to decipher where it had gone wrong. She knew that Emily had a reputation for being difficult, but it still hurt. Emily's words had stuck with her longer than they should have, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged at every turn. That night, she met Sarah in the common room, as they often did to unwind after a long day of rehearsals. Sarah was sprawled out on one of the couches, reading a music theory book, but she put it down when she saw Jessica enter, her expression softening. "What happened?" Sarah asked, sensing Jessica's mood instantly. Jessica sank into the chair across from her, running a hand through her hair. "It's Emily, again. I just feel like she doesn't respect me. She's been acting like I don't belong here." Sarah frowned, clearly not liking what she was hearing. "Don't let her get to you, Jess. She's not worth your energy." "I know," Jessica said, sighing. "It's just hard, you know. We're supposed to be a team, but it feels like she's always trying to bring me down, like I'm not good enough." "You are good enough. You belong here just as much as anyone else," Sarah insisted. "Emily's got her own issues, and honestly, it sounds like she's trying to make herself feel better by putting you down." Jessica didn't respond at first. She appreciated Sarah's words, but they didn't erase the nagging feeling that she wasn't measuring up. Emily was so sure of herself, so unapologetically confident, and Jessica couldn't help but wonder if that confidence was something she could ever truly possess. The next day, Jessica walked into class with a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't going to let Emily, or anyone, make her feel small. But as the days wore on, the tension continued to grow. Emily wasn't the only one who seemed to be sizing Jessica up. It was becoming clear that the competition was reaching a boiling point. And then came the final challenge. The Academy was holding a prestigious competition, a chance to perform a solo piece in front of a panel of judges, including some of the most influential musicians in the city. The winner would receive a full scholarship for the next year, as well as the opportunity to perform at one of New York's top venues. It was a game changer, a ticket to the next level of Jessica's career. But as soon as the competition was announced, the stakes became even higher. Everyone was vying for the chance to perform, and the pressure was palpable. In the weeks leading up to the competition, the practice rooms were filled with students working tirelessly on their pieces, each one trying to perfect their performance. Jessica had chosen a difficult, emotionally charged piece, one that had always resonated with her, one that she believed would showcase not only her technical skill but also her ability to convey deep emotion through music. But she had to admit, even to herself, that she was scared. The thought of performing in front of such an esteemed panel made her palms sweat, and the weight of the competition felt suffocating. The night before the competition, Jessica stayed up late, running through her piece over and over again. Each time she played, something felt off, like she wasn't quite hitting the right note. She was tired, physically, emotionally, but she knew she had to keep pushing. Around midnight, as she sat in the practice room, her fingers gently resting on the keys, she heard a knock on the door. "Jessica?" It was Sarah's voice. Jessica looked up, surprised to see her friend standing there. Sarah had her jacket on, clearly having been out for a while. "Hey," Sarah said, stepping inside. "I thought I'd check in. How are you doing?" Jessica shrugged, trying to force a smile. "I don't know. I keep messing up, and I'm just not sure if I'm ready for tomorrow. What if it's not good enough?" Sarah sat down beside her, her expression soft and understanding. "Hey, you've already done the hard part. You've worked so hard to get here. Tomorrow, just do what you do best. Let the music speak for itself." Jessica took a deep breath, looking down at the keys in front of her. "I'm scared. What if I don't live up to everyone's expectations? Who cares about everyone else's expectations?" Sarah said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "What matters is that you're true to yourself. You've got this, Jess. You've always had this." For the first time in a long while, Jessica felt a sense of peace. She wasn't competing against Emily or anyone else. She was competing against herself, pushing herself to be the best version of who she was. And that was enough. The competition would be a test, not just of her musical abilities, but of her character, her resolve. Tomorrow, she would step into the unknown once again. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The morning of the competition dawned, bright and clear. The air in New York City felt a little fresher, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Jessica woke early, the weight of the competition heavy on her chest. She had barely slept the night before, the anxiety keeping her awake as she ran through the piece in her mind over and over again. But now, with the day finally here, she couldn't back out. There was no turning back. As she made her way to the academy, the streets of the city buzzed with the usual chaos. Horns honked, people hurried down sidewalks, and the usual energy of the city felt oddly like a distant hum in her ears. She was focused, too focused to notice much of anything beyond the storm of thoughts swirling inside her head. Her fingers were cold as she gripped the strap of her bag, her palms clammy with nerves. She felt the butterflies in her stomach, the little tremor in her hands as she approached the academy doors. The sound of the piano's keys echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the challenge ahead. It wasn't just about playing, it was about being in that moment, about telling the story of her piece, about communicating something raw and real to an audience that would judge her every move. As she entered the building, she saw her classmates gathered in the lobby, each one dressed in formal attire, exuding the same air of quiet anticipation. A few of them exchanged glances, talking in hushed tones, but Jessica kept her eyes forward, avoiding their stares. She didn't need their judgment now. Sarah appeared beside her, her presence like a soft, reassuring breath. "You okay?" she asked quietly, giving Jessica a sympathetic smile. "I think so," Jessica replied, her voice unsteady. "I'm trying to be." Sarah gave her a quick hug, her arms wrapped tight around her. "You're going to do amazing, Jess. I know it." Jessica nodded, though the words didn't fully sink in. It wasn't about the praise, it was about getting through this moment. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let fear hold her back now. The competition hall was breathtaking. Large chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting warm light over the audience, and the grand piano sat in the center of the stage, waiting. Jessica stood backstage, peering out from behind the heavy velvet curtains as one of her classmates, a tall, confident violinist, took the stage. The judges, a panel of renowned musicians and instructors, were seated front and center, their expressions serious and unreadable. Jessica felt her pulse quicken as the sound of the violin filled the room, echoing off the walls. Her nerves threatened to overwhelm her, and she had to fight the urge to turn and leave. But she stayed, holding on to the one thing that had kept her grounded through all the uncertainty, her music. Her turn came sooner than she anticipated. The announcer's voice rang out, deep and steady, calling her name. "Next, we have Jessica Turner, performing a piece by Chopin." Jessica stepped onto the stage, the spotlight blinding at first, making it hard to see anything beyond the brilliant blur of light. The grand piano loomed in front of her, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. The audience fell silent, their attention fully on her. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her, and for a brief moment, she almost faltered. But she knew this moment had come, and there was no turning back. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys. The quiet hum of the city outside faded into nothing, and for the briefest of moments, everything seemed to still. The only thing that mattered was the music. As her hands began to move, the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room. It was a piece that had always resonated with her, its beauty, its complexity, the way it seemed to pull at something deep within her. She played, letting the music speak for itself, letting it fill the room with the emotions she had carried for so long. Her fingers moved fluidly, effortlessly across the keys, as though the piano and she were one. The tremors in her hands began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm and control. The music took over, and for the first time in months, Jessica felt completely at ease. She was no longer Jessica Turner, the uncertain student in the back of the room. She was just a pianist, nothing more, nothing less, lost in the beauty of the music. The piece built slowly, its intricate melodies sweeping through the hall, and as the final notes played, Jessica felt a profound sense of release. The tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her chest, all of it melted away. She had done it. She had given it everything she had. As the last note hung in the air, Jessica's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, taking in the silence that enveloped the room. It felt like an eternity before the applause erupted, loud and overwhelming. She opened her eyes, blinking in surprise as the judges, her classmates, and even the audience rose to their feet. The warmth of their applause washed over her, and she felt a flood of emotions that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the applause that mattered, it was the sense of accomplishment, the feeling that she had given everything she had, and that it had been enough. Backstage, Jessica was met by Sarah, who was beaming from ear to ear. "That was incredible," Sarah said, her voice full of admiration. "You were amazing out there. You nailed it." Jessica smiled, feeling her heart still racing. "Thanks," she said, still trying to catch her breath. "I think I actually did it. I really did it." "You didn't just do it," Sarah corrected her with a grin. "You owned it." Jessica laughed, feeling a sense of pride swell in her chest. It was one thing to be nervous about performing, but it was another to be able to step onto that stage and truly pour her soul into her music. She had finally found the courage to trust herself, to trust her talent. The competition wasn't over yet, but in that moment, Jessica knew something important. She had proved to herself that she belonged here, in this world of music and art. Whether she won or lost didn't matter as much as the fact that she had faced her fears and come out stronger. The rest of the day was a blur of performances, judges' deliberations, and more nervous anticipation. When the final round concluded, the judges stepped forward to announce the winners. Jessica stood off to the side, her hands shaking slightly, not sure if she could bear the suspense. "Third place," the announcer began, "goes to Emily Marshall." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Emily had been one of her biggest competitors, and hearing her name called was a moment of bittersweet victory. But there was no time to dwell, her own name was next. "And the winner of the 2025 Academy Piano Competition is Jessica Turner." For a moment, everything froze. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the audience erupted in applause, but she was still processing the words. She had won. It wasn't just a victory. It was validation, proof that everything she had worked for, all the struggles, the doubts, and the fears, had been worth it. She had made it. As Jessica made her way to the stage to accept her award, Sarah's eyes locked with hers in the audience, a huge smile on her face. Jessica felt a rush of gratitude toward her best friend, the one person who had always believed in her, even when she had struggled to believe in herself. When Jessica stood at the podium, holding the award in her hands, she didn't know what to say at first. But then, the words came naturally. "This is for everyone who told me I couldn't do it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And for everyone who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I'm just getting started." As the applause filled the room once more, Jessica felt a new sense of purpose surge through her. This was only the beginning. She had proven that she belonged here, that she was capable of so much more than she had ever realized. The future was wide open, and Jessica Turner was ready to take on the world. The days following the competition felt like a whirlwind. The excitement of winning the competition had barely begun to sink in when Jessica found herself caught up in an avalanche of new opportunities. Scholarships, private lessons with renowned musicians, and invitations to perform at prestigious events flooded in one after another. Her life had shifted in ways she couldn't have imagined just a few months ago. But as much as Jessica wanted to bask in the glory of her victory, she knew that this was only the beginning. Winning the competition was a huge accomplishment, but the real work, really proving herself in this unforgiving world, was just getting started. A few days after the competition, Jessica was sitting in the Academy's student lounge, sipping coffee and going over some sheet music. Her phone buzzed, a message from Sarah flashing on the screen. "You're killing it. Everyone's talking about how amazing your performance was. You know that, right?" Jessica couldn't help but smile as she typed back. "I'm just trying to keep up with the expectations. It's a lot to take in." The pressure, of course, was real. There was a part of her that wanted to run away from it all, to go back to her quiet life before the competition. But that wasn't an option anymore. The recognition had come with a price. Every eye in the Academy was now on her, and every move she made seemed to be under scrutiny. A few days later, Jessica was in the practice room, working through a particularly tricky passage from a new piece she had been assigned by one of her instructors. The piano keys felt foreign under her fingers, the sharpness of the notes cutting into her concentration. She couldn't focus. The distractions were too much. Every time she played a note, she could hear the whispers from her classmates in the hallway. "Did you hear Jessica's performance? She's really something special." And of course, there was Emily, still simmering with her own frustration after losing the competition. It wasn't that Jessica blamed Emily for being upset. In fact, she understood. Emily had worked tirelessly for years to earn her place, only to be outshone by a newcomer. But the way Emily had treated her afterward was more than just disappointment. It was cold, calculating, and full of resentment. Jessica had expected a moment of grace from Emily, a handshake, a congratulations, anything to acknowledge the journey they had both been on. But instead, Emily had avoided her altogether, her gaze pointedly ignoring Jessica whenever they crossed paths. One afternoon, as Jessica was leaving a lecture, she caught sight of Emily in the hallway. Emily was standing with a small group of students, talking animatedly about the upcoming recital. Jessica hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach. She wasn't looking for an apology, but maybe just an acknowledgement, something to break the awkward tension between them. "Hey, Emily," Jessica said, her voice tentative but warm. Emily turned, her expression hardening as their eyes met. "Oh, it's you," she said, a touch of sarcasm in her tone. "What can I do for you?" Jessica felt the sting of her words, but she pressed on, trying to remain calm. "I just wanted to say. I know we're both dealing with a lot right now. But I respect you. I've always admired your talent." Emily's lips twisted into a smirk, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold. "Don't flatter yourself, Turner. You won the competition. It doesn't mean you're better than everyone else." The words stung more than Jessica wanted to admit, but she kept her composure. "I'm not trying to be better. I just want to be the best version of myself." Emily scoffed and shook her head. "You can keep telling yourself that. But you can't change the fact that you're new here. You haven't earned anything yet." With that, Emily turned and walked away, her back stiff and her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Jessica stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. She had tried to break the ice, tried to make peace, but it was clear that Emily wasn't ready to let go of the bitterness. Part of Jessica wanted to fight back, to argue, but she knew better than to waste her energy on someone who wasn't ready to listen. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture. She had come here to make a name for herself, to grow as an artist and as a person. She couldn't let Emily or anyone else dictate her journey. A week later, Jessica found herself standing in front of a different kind of challenge, her first official recital since the competition. It was a smaller event, not nearly as high-profile as the competition, but it felt just as significant to her. This was her opportunity to demonstrate not just her technical skills, but her ability to connect with an audience, to express herself through her music. She stood backstage, pacing nervously as she waited for her turn. The anticipation in the room was palpable. The sound of voices, the shuffling of papers, and the murmur of other performers filled the space. But Jessica was lost in her own head, going over the piece she would be performing, a more complex and emotional work by Liszt. It was beautiful but challenging, and she had been struggling to bring it to life. "Jessica," a voice called out, and she turned to see her professor, Mr. Harrison, standing nearby. "You're up in 5 minutes." Jessica's stomach lurched. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she admitted, biting her lip. "This piece is hard." Mr. Harrison smiled knowingly. "The best performances often come when we're uncertain. Trust yourself, Jessica. Let the music speak for you." She nodded, though the nerves didn't subside. "Thanks," she said softly. When it was her turn, Jessica stepped onto the stage, the bright lights immediately blinding her as she took her seat at the grand piano. The audience was silent, waiting for her to begin. She swallowed hard, letting the weight of the moment settle in. As her fingers touched the keys, a sense of calm washed over her. The notes flowed, each one building upon the last, the power of the music carrying her through the difficult passages. She could feel the music pulsing through her veins, each note a reflection of her struggle, her growth, and her dreams. For the first time in a long time, Jessica felt completely at home. The audience disappeared, the competition faded into the background, and there was only her and the piano, telling the story together. When the final note echoed in the hall, Jessica sat still for a moment, letting the silence envelop her. And then, the applause began. It was soft at first, hesitant, but soon grew into a roaring wave of appreciation. Jessica blinked, her heart racing as she stood up to bow, overwhelmed by the reaction. She had done it. She had faced her fears and poured her soul into the music. And for the first time, she realized that it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about this moment, the pure connection between her, the piano, and the audience. As she walked off stage, Sarah was waiting for her, a wide smile on her face. "You did it!" Sarah exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. "That was incredible, Jess. You've come so far." Jessica felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness, but from a sense of accomplishment she hadn't known she needed. "I think I finally found my place," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. Sarah smiled, squeezing her hand. "You've always belonged here." And in that moment, Jessica knew that everything she had been through, every challenge, every struggle, had brought her to this point. She was no longer just the new girl at the academy. She was Jessica Turner, a pianist who had earned her place, and her journey was just beginning. Jessica's life had been nothing like it was before the competition. Everything felt different now, like the world had shifted beneath her feet. The constant attention, the praise, and the sudden surge of opportunities left her feeling overwhelmed. She had wanted this, had worked for it all her life, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure she was ready. She sat in the academy's practice room, the piano keys before her both comforting and intimidating. She had gotten so much attention after the competition, and now every performance felt like it was under the microscope. The expectations felt like a heavy cloak on her shoulders, and the pressure seemed to intensify with each passing day. Every time she looked up, someone was waiting for her to be perfect, whether it was her professors, her classmates, or even the audience. The applause from her recital still echoed in her mind, but instead of feeling elated, she felt a weight on her chest. What if I'm not as good as they think I am? She tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the sheet music in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she tried to concentrate on the difficult passage in front of her. The music, which had once felt like a natural extension of herself, now seemed distant. It wasn't that she didn't love it anymore, it was just that the pressure to perform at a certain level was making it harder to connect with it. A knock at the door broke her train of thought, and she looked up to see Mr. Harrison standing in the doorway. "Mind if I come in?" he asked with a gentle smile. "Of course," Jessica replied, trying to mask the unease in her voice. She wasn't sure what to expect from him. Mr. Harrison had been supportive, but now that she had won the competition, there was a different energy around her. Was he still going to push her as hard as before? He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "How are you feeling about your progress?" he asked, his voice soft but serious. Jessica sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought this would be easier. I thought that once I won the competition, everything would just fall into place, but it's not like that." Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. "You think the competition was the finish line?" he asked, crossing the room to stand beside her at the piano. Jessica shook her head, feeling foolish. "I guess I thought it would feel like I had arrived, you know. That I would finally be able to just enjoy playing without feeling like I have to prove something every time." Mr. Harrison chuckled softly. "It doesn't work like that. Winning doesn't mean you're done. It just means you've been given a platform to keep growing. You've earned a lot of attention, Jessica, and with that comes new challenges. But those challenges aren't obstacles, they're opportunities." Jessica looked up at him, uncertainty still clouding her thoughts. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. The competition, the spotlight, the constant pressure. It's a lot. Sometimes I wonder if I even want this. Mr. Harrison's smile softened. I understand. It's normal to feel that way. But if you've learned anything from your performance, it's that you have what it takes. You've already proved that you can rise to the occasion. The real question is, do you still love the music, Jessica? Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them back on the keys, letting her fingers graze the surface of the piano. I do, she whispered. I always have. Then you've got nothing to worry about. You just need to remember that the journey isn't about being perfect. It's about finding the joy in what you do, and continuing to evolve. Jessica nodded slowly, feeling the weight on her chest begin to lift, just a little. I'll try to remember that. That evening, as Jessica walked home through the quiet streets of the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that her world had shifted in ways she hadn't fully understood yet. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't need to have all the answers right now. The road ahead was still long, and she was still learning how to navigate it. As she passed by her favorite cafe, the one she had visited countless times when she first moved to New York, she noticed a familiar figure sitting by the window, Sarah. She waved as she approached, and Sarah's face lit up. Hey, stranger, Sarah said with a grin. I was wondering when you'd stop by. You've been hiding out in that practice room, huh? Jessica smiled, sliding into the seat across from her. You have no idea. I feel like my brain is going to explode from all the things I'm supposed to do. Sarah's eyes softened, her concern evident. I get it. There's a lot of pressure. But you've got to remember, you don't have to do this alone. You've got me. And I know you've got something big in you, Jessica. It's only a matter of time before you realize it. Jessica nodded, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. Thanks, Sarah. I don't know. I feel like I'm still trying to figure out who I am in all of this. The competition, the success, everything feels so fast. Slow down, Sarah said gently. You've earned your place, but there's no rush to get anywhere. Just take it one step at a time. The world isn't going anywhere. The next morning, Jessica found herself in the practice room again. This time, however, the weight of expectation didn't feel quite as heavy. She still felt the pressure, but there was something different in the way she approached the piano today. It wasn't about impressing anyone, or even about winning. It was about the music itself, the way it spoke to her, the way it had always spoken to her. She played the first few notes of a new piece, one she had never attempted before. The chords were complex, the rhythm intricate, but for the first time in days, she felt connected to it. The pressure wasn't gone, but it didn't define her anymore. Jessica was on a journey, and it was hers to take. There was no finish line. No perfect way to play. There was only the music, and the story she had yet to tell. As the weeks passed, Jessica found herself performing more frequently, each time a new opportunity to share her passion and grow as an artist. The pressure didn't disappear, but it became easier to manage, especially with the support of her professors, Sarah, and her own growing confidence. She had learned that there would always be challenges ahead, but she was learning how to face them, one note at a time. One afternoon, as she was preparing for another recital, Jessica received an unexpected call from her mother. Jess, I just saw your performance video online, her mom said, her voice filled with pride. I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard to get here. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. Thanks, Mom, she replied quietly. I miss you. I miss you too, sweetheart. But I can see how far you've come. Keep pushing, keep learning. You've got so much potential. Her mom's words echoed in her mind long after the call ended. She wasn't alone in this journey. And with each new challenge, each new performance, Jessica knew that she was slowly becoming the artist she had always dreamed of being. The road ahead would be filled with more obstacles and uncertainties, but for the first time in a long while, Jessica felt ready to face them. And this time, she wouldn't face them alone. The weeks that followed Jessica's phone call with her mother were a blur of performances, practice sessions, and constant reminders that her life had irrevocably changed. She had earned a reputation, one that now carried both honor and weight, and it was something she couldn't escape. Every performance was scrutinized, every gesture examined, and the pressure to succeed was suffocating. Yet, through it all, there was a voice in the back of her mind telling her that she wasn't ready, that she hadn't truly earned her place yet. It was during one of these moments of self-doubt that it happened. Jessica had been preparing for a major recital, a prestigious event that would showcase the best of the Academy's students. The night before, as she ran through her piece one last time in the practice room, something felt off. The music, which had once flowed through her with ease, now felt like a distant echo. She couldn't focus on the notes, and her fingers fumbled over the keys. By the time she stopped playing, her hands were trembling. The same panic that had plagued her in the early days of the Academy resurfaced with a vengeance. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? Her breath quickened, and for a moment, she thought about skipping the recital altogether. She wasn't ready. She couldn't do this. The next day, Jessica stood backstage at the recital hall, her heart hammering in her chest. The heavy curtain in front of her created a barrier between her and the world beyond. She could hear the audience murmuring in anticipation, and she wondered how many of them had heard about her competition victory. Did they expect her to be perfect? Or worse, did they expect something grander than she could deliver? Her mind was racing, but just before she could spiral further into anxiety, a familiar voice broke through the noise. "Hey, Jessica," Sarah's voice came from behind her. Jessica turned to see her friend standing there, her warm smile a beacon in the storm of her emotions. "You okay?" Sarah asked, her gaze steady as she looked at Jessica, sensing her nervousness. Jessica forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know. I'm scared. I've been practicing for weeks, but it doesn't feel like enough." Sarah stepped closer, her expression softening with concern. "Look, you've earned everything you have right now. The people out there, they don't need you to be perfect. They just want to hear you play your music. The same way you've always played. The way you've always felt it." Jessica took a deep breath. "But what if it's not enough? What if I mess up?" Sarah put a hand on her shoulder. "If you mess up, you get back up and keep going. But you won't mess up. Not because you're flawless, but because you're you. And that's enough." Jessica closed her eyes, trying to center herself. Sarah was right. It wasn't about perfection, it was about the music. The connection she had with it. And if she could let go of the fear for just a moment, she might actually find that magic again. When Jessica took the stage a few minutes later, her hands felt clammy, but she forced herself to focus. She glanced out into the audience, seeing a mix of students, professors, and a few familiar faces. She couldn't make out individual details, but the collective gaze was enough to send a rush of nerves through her. She sat at the piano, hands shaking, and the first few notes felt unsteady, like a fragile foundation under her fingers. The tension was palpable, but then something unexpected happened. She took a deep breath, let the music wash over her, and the panic subsided. The keys felt warm beneath her fingertips. The room around her seemed to disappear, and all that was left was the piano, the music, and her. The complex phrases of Chopin's Nocturne, which had felt impossible just hours earlier, now came alive in her hands. She no longer focused on the audience or the judges or what anyone might think. It was just her and the music. The way it had always been. As she finished the final notes, the silence that followed was thick, and for a moment, Jessica was unsure of what to do. Had they liked it? Were they disappointed? And then, as if on cue, the applause broke out, strong and enthusiastic. A wave of relief rushed over her. She had done it. Not perfectly, but honestly. She stood, bowing as the applause grew louder, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of expectation lift, just a little. The music hadn't been flawless, but it had been hers. And that was enough. Backstage, Sarah was waiting for her, her face beaming with pride. "See? You did it," she said, pulling Jessica into a tight hug. "You were amazing." Jessica laughed, a little breathless. "I don't know about amazing, but I did it. You were incredible. It's not about being perfect, Jess. It's about being true to yourself. And you were." Jessica felt a warmth spread through her chest. She was starting to understand that Sarah was right. It wasn't about chasing perfection or worrying about what others thought. It was about letting go of the expectations, both her own and those placed on her by others, and just playing from the heart. The next few days passed in a blur of congratulatory messages, emails, and performance invitations. As her name spread through the academy and beyond, Jessica found herself faced with more opportunities than she could have ever imagined. But there was still a lingering feeling deep inside her, a fear that she would once again be judged based on her past achievements rather than who she was becoming. As she sat in her apartment one evening, reflecting on the whirlwind of events, Jessica received a text from her mother. "So proud of you, Jessica. You've worked so hard for this. Keep playing. Keep growing." The words filled her with a sense of peace. She wasn't alone in this. She never had been. The next day, as Jessica sat down at the piano again, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. She no longer had to chase perfection. All she needed to do was trust in herself, trust in the music, and take each step forward, one note at a time. And that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Jessica's life continued to unfold in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had grown accustomed to the attention, to the constant buzz of congratulatory messages, and to the whispers of admiration that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But there was something else now, something that gnawed at her in the quiet moments. The recognition felt heavy. Each performance felt like an audition for her next one. Each new offer, an obligation. She couldn't escape the pressure of being the one to watch, the girl who had stunned everyone with her piano skills. The invitations to perform kept coming in. It was thrilling at first, but soon, Jessica began to feel like she was caught in a whirlwind, spinning out of control. Every performance demanded more of her, and she had to work harder to maintain the standard that had been set for her. She was no longer playing just for herself. She was playing for an audience, for expectations, her own and everyone else's. And that was starting to take a toll. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Jessica collapsed onto her bed. She stared at the ceiling, her body aching, her mind racing. The weight of it all was becoming unbearable. She wanted to scream, to run away from it all, but there was no escape. She had worked too hard to get here. She couldn't give up now. But what if she wanted to? The thought haunted her. The following day, as Jessica arrived at the academy, she found herself walking through the halls with a heaviness in her chest. It wasn't just the pressure of her performances, it was the constant scrutiny. It felt like everyone was watching, waiting for her to slip. Her professors, her peers, even the janitors who cleaned the halls seemed to give her that knowing glance. The weight of their expectations was suffocating. She had always been the quiet, diligent student, the one who spent hours in the practice room, perfecting every note. But now, it felt different. She was no longer just Jessica, the hardworking pianist. She was Jessica, the prodigy. The next big thing. And with that title came a burden she hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about living up to a name, to a reputation. Later that afternoon, as Jessica sat in a practice room, trying to get through a new piece, the door opened, and Sarah walked in. "Hey, Sarah greeted her, a look of concern on her face. You look exhausted. What's going on? Jessica didn't even look up. I don't know, she muttered. Everything's just, a lot right now. I thought I'd feel more accomplished, you know. But instead, it's just, overwhelming. I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat beside her. You've been carrying a lot, Jess. The competition, the performances, the expectations. It's all a lot for anyone. But you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to be everything for everyone. Jessica finally looked up at her friend. But I don't want to disappoint anyone. I've worked so hard for this. I can't just, stop. I'm not saying you should stop, Sarah said gently. But you also have to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup, Jess. You need to take a step back sometimes. Rediscover why you started playing in the first place, just for you. Jessica let out a deep sigh. I don't even know what that feels like anymore. Sarah's expression softened. You will. But you've got to give yourself the space to find it again. Just remember that you don't owe anyone anything except your best effort. And sometimes, your best means taking a break. It's okay to not always be on top. Jessica looked at Sarah, her chest tight. She wasn't sure she could do it. She wasn't sure she could stop, because if she did, what would that mean? Was she afraid of failure, or was she just afraid of being forgotten? Maybe you're right, Jessica whispered. I just feel so, lost. Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand. You're not lost. You're just on a detour. And that's okay. You're allowed to find your way again. Later that evening, Jessica sat at her piano, her fingers lightly grazing the keys, not with the intention of playing, but just to feel the cool surface beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the piano fill the space around her. It was quiet. Peaceful. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about a performance or an audience. She wasn't worrying about the next recital or the next opportunity. She was just, playing. For herself. And in that moment, she realized something important. She had lost sight of why she started playing in the first place. It was never about the accolades, or the fame, or even the recognition. It had always been about the music. It had always been about the way it made her feel, how it allowed her to express things words never could. The music wasn't a means to an end. It was the end itself. The next day, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't keep pushing herself the way she had been. She needed a break, not from the music, but from the weight of everyone's expectations. She needed to rediscover what made her love playing in the first place. She needed to get back to the place where the piano was an extension of her soul, not a tool for validation. She walked into the office of her professor, Mr. Harrison, and took a seat across from him. Mr. Harrison, she began, her voice steady but uncertain. I think I need some time off from performing. I need to focus on myself. On finding my love for the music again. Mr. Harrison looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, he nodded. I think that's a wise decision, Jessica. Sometimes, the best way to move forward is to take a step back. To remember why you started, and to allow yourself the space to grow. I just don't want to disappoint anyone, she admitted, her voice small. You won't disappoint anyone, he reassured her. Your growth is more important than any performance. And anyone who truly cares about your artistry will understand that. You're not a machine, Jessica. You're an artist. And artists need time to breathe, to reflect, and to find new inspiration. Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders, just a little. She wasn't giving up. She was taking control of her own journey. And that, in itself, was an act of strength. As she walked back to her apartment that evening, Jessica felt a renewed sense of peace. It wasn't that the pressures had disappeared, they hadn't. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was making the decision that was right for her. She didn't know where this detour would lead, but she was finally starting to understand that the path to true fulfillment didn't have to be rushed. There would be time for everything. But for now, she was going to focus on the music, and on herself. And that was enough. The following weeks were a quiet time for Jessica, a period of reflection and reconnection. The world outside still moved at its usual pace, performances continued, invitations arrived, and her name was still being whispered in circles of admiration, but she had decided to step back from it all. For the first time since she had entered the academy, she allowed herself the luxury of simply existing without the burden of expectations. She spent her days in the practice room, but not with the same frantic energy that had once driven her. She no longer felt the pressure of perfecting each note, nor the relentless ticking of a clock that reminded her of the next performance. Instead, she allowed herself to explore new music, to experiment with different styles, and to play without any other goal than enjoyment. It was an unfamiliar feeling, freedom. In the silence between the notes, she could hear her own thoughts again. She could hear the parts of herself that had been lost in the scramble for approval and success. Her fingers no longer hovered over the keys in nervous anticipation, but instead moved with intention, feeling the weight of each note, each chord. For the first time in a long time, Jessica didn't worry about the audience. She didn't worry about what others might think. It was just her and the piano. Jessica opened her eyes and gave her friend a soft smile. "It's going. I'm starting to feel like myself again." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Really? I thought you were still taking a break from performing." "I am," Jessica said, nodding. "But I've realized something. I don't need to be on stage to feel fulfilled. I've been so focused on impressing others that I forgot why I started playing in the first place. I just love the music." Sarah's expression softened, and she walked over to the piano, sitting down beside Jessica. "That's a big realization, Jess. It's not always about the recognition or the applause. It's about what you feel when you play, right?" Jessica nodded, her fingers lightly pressing the keys once more. "Exactly. And it feels so freeing, you know. It's like I'm finally giving myself permission to just be." Sarah leaned back in her seat, a smile tugging at her lips. "I'm proud of you. It's not easy to step back when everyone expects so much from you. But I think you're finally finding your balance." "I hope so," Jessica replied quietly. "I'm still figuring it out." As the weeks passed, Jessica continued to immerse herself in her music, allowing herself to explore new genres and techniques. She dabbled in jazz and even tried composing her own pieces. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about expression. One evening, as she worked on a new piece, a slow, melodic jazz arrangement, Jessica's phone buzzed with a message. She picked it up, half expecting another performance invitation or a congratulatory message. But this one was different. It was from her mother. "Your father and I are so proud of you, Jessica. We've heard about your recent performances and we're both amazed by how far you've come. But we also want you to remember that no matter how much you achieve, we'll always be here to support you. Just don't forget where you came from." Jessica smiled at the words, feeling a wave of warmth wash over her. Despite everything, the fame, the expectations, her family still grounded her. She wasn't just a performer or a prodigy to them. She was their daughter, someone they loved unconditionally. And that meant more to her than any applause ever could. She set the phone down and returned to the piano, her fingers once again finding their place on the keys. The music flowed, slow and beautiful, a reflection of her journey, a reminder that she had come this far, but the road was still ahead of her. As the semester neared its end, Jessica's professors began to approach her with questions about her future. The academy was eager to see what direction she would take next, and they wanted to help guide her in making decisions about her career. But each time they asked, Jessica hesitated. She had spent so much time chasing an ideal of success that she wasn't sure what success truly meant to her anymore. One day, after a long conversation with Mr. Harrison, her professor, Jessica finally found the courage to voice her concerns. Mr. Harrison, she began, her voice tentative. I know everyone's expecting me to take the next step, to perform at bigger venues, to be the next great name in classical music. But I'm not sure if that's what I want anymore. Mr. Harrison listened carefully, his gaze unwavering. What do you want, Jessica? I want to play music that moves me, she said slowly. I want to create something that feels real, that speaks to who I am as a person. I don't want to chase fame or recognition. I just want to play, because it's what makes me feel alive. Mr. Harrison smiled softly, nodding. Then that is what you must do. Follow the music, Jessica. Let it guide you, and don't worry about the rest. The rest will follow if you stay true to yourself. Jessica felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The pressure had been mounting for so long, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she realized that she didn't have to follow anyone's path but her own. She could choose her own journey, based on what she loved, not on what others expected of her. As the school year came to a close, Jessica began to make plans for the future. She wasn't ready to jump back into the limelight just yet, but she had ideas for performances that felt authentic, for collaborations with other musicians who shared her passion, and for projects that allowed her to grow without the pressure of perfection. One night, as she sat on her bed, staring at the plans she had made, she felt a deep sense of peace. The music would always be there for her, and no matter where it took her, she knew she would never stop playing. It wasn't about the applause. It wasn't about the fame. It was about the journey, the art, and the freedom to be herself. And that was enough. The summer break brought with it a sense of anticipation, a chance to reflect on everything Jessica had learned during the last few months. She had given herself the time and space to discover her love for music again, free from the pressure of performances and competitions. Now, as the days grew longer and the sun bathed the world in golden light, Jessica felt ready to take the next step, but it wasn't the step everyone expected. It wasn't the polished path of fame or success in the traditional sense. Instead, Jessica was eager to forge her own path, one that allowed her to explore and experiment, to stay true to her passion while maintaining the freedom she had so recently regained. She had decided to take a different approach to her career, focusing less on the high-profile performances that had once consumed her and more on smaller, more intimate projects. She was interested in collaborations that allowed for creative freedom, working with other artists who weren't just after accolades, but who wanted to make meaningful, emotional music. For the first time, Jessica didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone except herself. One warm afternoon, Jessica met with Sarah at their favorite coffee shop, a small place tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, the clink of cups, and the soft rhythm of a jazz tune playing in the background. As they sat at a corner table, Sarah looked at her friend with a knowing smile. "So," Sarah said, taking a sip of her iced coffee, "how's the new plan going? Still sticking with it?" Jessica laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Yes, absolutely. I'm done chasing the spotlight. It just doesn't feel right anymore. I've decided to focus on music that speaks to me, not what's expected of me." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What exactly does that look like? Are you going to be playing at small venues now?" "In a way," Jessica replied, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I'm thinking of collaborating with some local musicians, people who are just as passionate about the music as I am. I want to explore different genres, maybe do some original compositions. And I want to work on projects that allow me to experiment and grow. I'm not going to focus on perfecting my image for an audience anymore. I just want to create." "I think that sounds incredible," Sarah said, grinning. "You've got such a gift, Jess. If anyone can make it work, it's you. But I have to ask, do you feel like you're walking away from something? From the career everyone expected you to have? Jessica paused, looking out the window at the bustling streets outside. It was a question she had been asking herself for weeks now. Maybe I am. But I'm not walking away from music. I'm walking away from the idea that I have to be something I'm not. For too long, I let other people define what my success should look like. Now I want to define it for myself. Sarah leaned back in her chair, clearly impressed. I'm proud of you. I think this is going to be your best work yet. Jessica's newfound clarity became the foundation for her next move. She began reaching out to other musicians, composers, and artists, looking for collaborations that would allow her to break free from the constraints of what she had known. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Musicians were eager to work with her, not because of her name or her previous accolades, but because of her genuine love for the music. One of her first projects was with Alex, a talented jazz guitarist she had met during one of her impromptu performances at a local cafe. He had been captivated by her ability to blend classical technique with improvisation. Alex was interested in combining jazz and classical elements, a fusion of styles that had always fascinated Jessica. Together, they spent hours working on new arrangements, exploring different sounds and textures. For Jessica, it was a creative rebirth, a chance to push herself outside her comfort zone and embrace new possibilities. One evening, while working on a new piece, Jessica and Alex played for hours, letting the music guide them. They fed off each other's energy, pushing each other to experiment with different chords, rhythms, and tempos. For the first time in a long time, Jessica felt like she was truly alive, playing not to impress, but to create something raw and honest. It wasn't long before word spread about their collaborations. The local arts community took notice of their unique blend of jazz and classical music, and soon they were performing at small venues and intimate gatherings, where the audience could feel the energy between the performers. Jessica was no longer concerned with the size of the crowd, she was simply immersed in the joy of creating music with people who shared her passion. And yet, as she gained recognition in this new, more personal space, she still grappled with the fear of being forgotten. What if people stopped paying attention to her? What if they moved on to the next prodigy? But every time she felt the familiar anxiety creeping back, she reminded herself that this was about her journey, not the expectations of others. Her performances were intimate, raw, and real. She played for herself and for the people who connected with the music. And in that, Jessica found a kind of peace she hadn't known before. One night, after a particularly moving performance at a local jazz club, Jessica and Alex sat on the rooftop of the venue, looking out at the city lights. The night was quiet, the air cool against their skin. The conversation turned to their future projects, but Jessica couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. Do you ever think about where you might have been if you hadn't taken this turn? Alex asked, his voice low. Jessica took a deep breath, considering the question. I used to, she said slowly. I used to think about what I might have missed out on, about what everyone else thought my success should look like. But now, I don't regret it. I've found something that feels real. I've found my way back to the music, and that's all that matters to me. Alex nodded, a knowing smile on his face. I think this is just the beginning for you, Jessica. You're finally playing for the right reasons. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica believed him. As the city lights flickered below, she realized that her journey had come full circle. It hadn't been a straight path, it hadn't been without challenges, doubts, and moments of uncertainty. But every twist and turn had led her to where she was now, a place of peace, of purpose, and of passion. She wasn't just a prodigy anymore. She was an artist, free to explore and create, without the weight of others' expectations on her shoulders. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The music would always be there. And so would she. As the months rolled on, Jessica's life took on a rhythm of its own. No longer weighed down by the pressure of being the next great name in classical music, she had embraced a slower, more deliberate pace. Her performances were more intimate, more connected to the heart of the music, and the audiences she played for felt that shift. There was a new depth to her playing, an authenticity that was impossible to ignore. She continued to collaborate with Alex, exploring jazz and classical fusions that no one had thought to combine before. Their music was unpredictable, raw, and beautiful. Sometimes it was light and airy, other times, it was deep and soulful. But it was always real. But even with all the joy of creating new music, Jessica knew that her journey wasn't yet complete. Her decision to step away from the mainstream world of high-profile performances had allowed her to rediscover what music meant to her, but it had also opened her eyes to new possibilities. She couldn't help but wonder if there was still something more she was meant to do, something bigger, something that would finally bring everything she had learned together. It was during a quiet evening, while sitting at the piano alone in the practice room, that she had an epiphany. The idea had been floating at the back of her mind for some time, but now it felt clear, certain. She had always believed in the power of music to change lives, to speak to people in ways words never could. So, why not bring that idea into the world more boldly? Over the next few weeks, Jessica worked tirelessly on a new project. She began composing a piece that blended her love of classical music with her newfound passion for jazz and improvisation. But this wasn't just any composition. This would be her magnum opus, a piece that would not only challenge her as a musician but also tell the story of her journey. It would capture the raw emotions of her struggles, the lessons learned, and the freedom she had found. And she wanted to bring that music to people who, like her, needed to hear that they weren't alone in their pain, their hopes, or their dreams. Jessica decided that this composition would not be played in any conventional venue. Instead, she envisioned a traveling performance, one that would take her around the country to places where people might not normally have access to the kind of music she was creating. She would perform in small towns, in community centers, and in schools, anywhere people needed to hear a message of hope, resilience, and the power of music to heal. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be obstacles, and the performances might not always be polished. But she didn't care. This wasn't about perfection. It was about sharing something real with the world. Jessica made a decision: she would start with her hometown. She would go back to the small town where she had grown up, the place where she first picked up the piano and where she learned that music was more than just notes on a page. It was where her love for music began, and it was where she wanted to return, both as an artist and as the person she had become. The idea was met with enthusiasm from the local community. Jessica was a beloved figure there, and they had all followed her journey from afar. They knew her as the shy, brilliant child who had once played for them at the local library, before she left to pursue bigger dreams. They were eager to see her again and to hear the music she had created. The night of her performance in her hometown arrived, and Jessica felt a mix of excitement and nerves. As she stood backstage, waiting for the cue to step into the spotlight, she thought back to the person she had been when she first started performing. The young girl who was desperate to impress, the one who sought validation from every note she played. That girl was still a part of her, but now, she was no longer afraid. She had learned that it wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about telling her truth through the music. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the crowd greeted her with warmth and affection. The small venue was filled with people who had watched her grow up, and as she sat at the piano, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. These were the people who had supported her from the very beginning. She began to play, and as the notes filled the room, she felt a connection unlike anything she had experienced before. This was her music, raw, emotional, and real. It was a reflection of everything she had been through, everything she had learned. And as she played, she felt a deep sense of peace. This was where she was meant to be. The audience was silent, captivated by the music. It was as if the notes were speaking directly to their hearts, telling them a story they didn't know they needed to hear. Jessica played for over an hour, her fingers moving with ease over the keys, weaving in and out of jazz and classical melodies. She felt every note, every chord, in her bones. As the final note lingered in the air, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't the kind of applause she had gotten at grand performances, where the sound was more about admiration than connection. This was a standing ovation, a show of gratitude and understanding. Jessica's heart swelled with emotion as she took a bow, grateful for the people who had never stopped believing in her. After the performance, Jessica mingled with the audience, reconnecting with old friends, teachers, and family members. She was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. But what touched her the most were the stories people shared with her. Many spoke of how her music had inspired them, how it had helped them through difficult times. Some of them had never thought they would be able to experience live music like this, and now, here she was, playing just for them. As the evening came to a close, Jessica realized that this was the most fulfilling performance she had ever given. It wasn't about the applause or the accolades. It was about the connection, the shared experience of music that spoke to everyone in the room. This was the kind of music she wanted to create, the kind that healed, that brought people together, and that helped them find hope in the darkness. Jessica's journey had come full circle. She had begun as a young girl with a dream, unsure of herself but certain of her love for music. Along the way, she had faced challenges, had been pushed to the edge, and had even considered walking away. But in the end, it was the music that brought her back. And now, as she looked out at the crowd of people who had supported her from the beginning, she knew she had found her purpose. She wasn't just a pianist anymore. She was a storyteller, a healer, and a guide. Through her music, she had found herself, and in doing so, she had given others the chance to find themselves too. The final note had been played, but the music would never stop. And that was exactly how it was meant to be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?